Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Social Venture Partners Responds series. Today, we are going to be speaking about the future responds, and we have an esteemed panel with us that I will be introducing in just a moment. But before we start, I wanted to just chat with you for a second about Social Venture Partners. Social Venture Partners has been in Dallas now for over 20 years, and we are an organization of engaged philanthropists, men and women who bring their time, their talents, their business acumen, their financial resources to the support of local social entrepreneurs and social enterprises here in Dallas. Many of the organizations that are serving very effectively on the front lines in our city right now as a response to this crisis, Social Venture Partners has been a part of helping to shore up and to grow their capacity so they can meet these kinds of challenges. I would like to thank our sponsor today, Something Good Consulting, for being with us, and I would like to thank a couple of our partners, Heather Gilker and Roy Lopez with the Federal Reserve, who helped me bring this panel together. Thank you folks so much. Our panel today is a really incredible group of servant leaders. We have joining with us Matrice Ellis-Kirk, who is with RSR Partners, Rob Kaplan, who is President and CEO of the Federal Reserve of Dallas, and Tom Luce, founder and chairman of Texas 2036. We're going to jump right in. We only have an hour, and I know that we could take many hours with each of our panelists and your wealth of expertise. But Matrice, I thought I would start with you, since this crisis not only is a healthcare one, but it is certainly an economic one. And many in our community are suffering from loss of jobs, or a family member is suffering a loss of jobs. Your firm works with major corporations. Tell me what you're hearing and what you're experiencing in the economic world of our companies and our employers. And I think you're on mute, so if you'll take yourself off mute, we'll hear your response to that.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Tony, for inviting me to join in RSR. We have seen a tremendous change in the economy in general. Many of the assignments that we had been working on prior to COVID-19 actually came to a standstill, while then we had a number that have increased. And it really has been by industry. In all candor, if you look at our retail and our higher education groups, both of those saw a significant decline in assignments and us being engaged. Whereas with our industrial practice, our healthcare and life sciences practices, and financial services, fintech, those continue to see continuation as well as increasing work. So, what we're seeing across the board is differing experiences by industry. But what we're really seeing are the change in the skill sets that are being sought. A lot of the experiences that individuals had from the downturn in the economy in 2008, when we had assignments then, a lot of the work was surrounding skill sets around adaptability, navigating ambiguity, understanding how to do more with less. And so the skill sets are really what we have identified as what seems to be shifting. The work now, that there is a sense of where people are right now, certainly not under, and again, I'll say right now, because the question continues to come up, will we have another downturn in the summer months? But regardless of that, we are seeing an increase in especially the consumer package and businesses that really navigated in that world were not as strong. Today, we are seeing an increase in those assignments.
Tom, many in our audience are learning about your project for the very first time. Could you talk a little bit about Texas 2036, what you folks are doing, and how the crisis might have changed some of your projections for the future?
Well, let me first talk about the formation of Texas 2036 was really designed to bring long-term thinking to our government systems and to the business leadership across the state to focus on how we could keep Texas a viable place and a place where people really wanted to do business and raise a family and have a good quality of life. And although we've had a tremendous amount of short-term success recently, our growth has been unequal, and we have many parts of the state that have not experienced the same degree of growth that our urban areas have. And we felt the way to focus on the future was to bring together a broad coalition of people, racial, ethnic diversity, bipartisanship, to have prominent Democrats, Republicans, people who had not been active in the public sector. We have a large board. And most importantly, we felt the way to break the political polarization was by bringing data into the forefront. So we've accumulated over 350 public data sets, which have enabled us to project future problems of the state, areas we need to address. The pandemic has impacted us as it has everybody. I think it makes our mission even more important. You know, I think that we're going to face some enormous challenges in this state in the near future. But in doing that, we have to think about the future. And the analogy that I've used in talking to many people about the impact of the pandemic, I was heavily involved in the Hurricane Harvey recovery. And that was a disaster of monumental proportions in one region of our state. But I think what we learned from that was you have to get people off the roofs. You have to address short-term urgency. But then you have to think about medium-term and long-term strategies to build resilience to mitigate against future disasters. I think that applies to this situation. A crisis like this pandemic, you know, I have 7 grandsons. I tell them crisis doesn't build character, it reveals character, and it reveals strengths and weaknesses. It revealed a huge weakness. We should have known, and we did know it was there, but it revealed it in stark terms about our healthcare system, the digital divide, the lack of government systems working. You know, there's been a lot of concentration on preventing the healthcare system from crashing, but our government systems are crashing at state government level. We've had ransomware that's shut down our judicial system, our workers' comp system crashed. You know, we're seeing that we have some long-term issues that have to be addressed to prevent and mitigate against future disasters, whether they're pandemics or an oil bust like we're doing. We're suffering a double whammy now. So the pandemic is making coming together as a state and thinking about how we invest in the future even more critical. Texas, fortunately, let me say with Rob on the phone, I'm glad that the Federal Reserve can digitally create money. The state can't. And we have to balance our budget. And we're going to face some real issues coming in January. And we have to think about how to invest limited resources.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Rob, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I want to thank you. You know, the Federal Reserve in Dallas has been the day 2 host of our annual conference, Big Bang, which is a social impact conference that we do here in Dallas. And you all have been so gracious to host us these last several years. So thank you for that. You know, Tom talked about a little bit about the powers of the Federal Reserve and what you all can do. You know, many of us and many in our audience probably drive by your building there close to Clyde Warren Park and maybe have never been in and don't really understand the relationship between the Federal Reserve. When we think about that, we think about it federally. We don't think about it as being here in Dallas and what connection it might have to the local economy. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah. So we're obviously there's 12 reserve banks in the United States. We're one of the 12. We're highly integrated. We do things together as a system. And we have a big research department here that focuses on the national and global economy, but we have a big research department that focuses also on the local economy. And we provide a whole series of services for the banks on payments and a number of other things in the local economy. But and we try to be very open and be highly engaged in the local economy and figure out where the vulnerabilities are and try to reach out and get involved. And some of the things Tom Luce was referring to, healthcare, skills training, education, and a lot of the vulnerabilities and opportunities in the state. But I mean, this, what I'm spending a lot of my time on since this crisis started, though, is trying to work with everyone else to stabilize the financial markets, make sure companies, small companies, medium-sized companies, big companies have access to capital. We're a lender, though. We're not a grant maker. And so we can help make sure that companies have access to lending. The federal government and fiscal authorities provide grants. And so I spent a lot of time talking to local business people, big and small, and citizens and nonprofits to try to understand, and elected officials, try to understand what the big issues are here, what they're experiencing, relate that to the work that we're doing system-wide. And so the local presence all throughout this district, you know, in Houston, San Antonio, El Paso, and Louisiana, New Mexico, give us great insight, which I think helps inform what we're doing nationally.
Thank you. Tom,
could I add there, and if for those who are listening who didn't hear Chairman Powell on 60 Minutes, that was just a prime example of leadership in a crisis. I mean, he was communicating competence, confidence, and balance between safety and economic return. And I just thought it was a wonderful job of projecting confidence and competence. And Rob, I know you all have done the same thing here locally. And leadership like that from the, and I would say, you know, I qualify the Fed as quasi-public-private in many respects. That type of leadership from the private industry and the public-private partnerships in our country, I think is going to be essential to avoid political polarization, because this pandemic is going to have a long shelf life here. And we're going to have to hold together and have an economic mobility program that takes into account the vast diversity of our economy. The small business impact in our state, it's all over the country. It's just going to be enormous. And this is going to be a long ride. And this is not going to go away immediately.
Tom, your organization, Texas 2036, talks a lot about creating data and research and facts to really influence legislation going forward. You mentioned that you think this might be an opportunity to kind of refocus on data and expert opinion in shaping policy. Do you still believe that? Do you think that that is something that you folks can really influence going forward?
I do. I see a couple of real opportunities that we all have to take advantage of. Again, we knew they were there, but now may be the time to maximize the potential in 3 areas. I would say in particular, this is, we're going to have huge healthcare issues moving forward. Hopefully the public has learned the importance of what I call population health, that the health of your neighbor has an impact on you. We already led the nation in uninsured, that number is going to dramatically increase by the number of people who were laid off from jobs in which they had private insurance. And although they had the legal right to buy COBRA, they may not have the resources to buy COBRA. That's going to expand the uninsured pool. Number two, we were already seeing cracks in the non-COVID healthcare system. That's an important part of our GDP, as well as the healthcare of our population. We're seeing things like mammograms postponed, people getting heart checkups postponed. That's going to have an underground impact on our healthcare system, which impacts everybody. And yet, all of a sudden, because of COVID, we knocked down all the barriers to telemedicine. Well, how are we going to implement and continue telemedicine, where it works, where it doesn't work? How are we going to monitor how it works? Same thing in education. We're going to have virtual education is going to be with us, but we saw the digital divide manifest itself dramatically in urban environments and rural environments. How are we going to address that as a state? If every child in the state is not educated, our economy will not work. We are restricting immigration. Our native population is not keeping up in the workforce skills of the future. And our economy is not going to work unless we really step up our game in education and workforce. And nobody knows that better than Rob.
Thank you. Matrice, I want to check back in with you and see if your sound system is working better.
I hope it's better. Is it, can you still hear a ringing?
Yeah, we still hear that. We still have that static thing. Try it again.
Okay. Well, it looks like this technology is, we're seeing the benefits and the not so deep benefits of technology.
The challenges. Tom brought up the whole point about how we are adjusting to different ways and dropping barriers so that people can access more. My question around that is to Rob first is, do you think these kinds of shifts are going to stick? Do you think that we are going to be investing in more ways for more people to access these kinds of technologies and healthcare things? Or do you think it's going to try to go back to business as usual, where so many of our folks are left out of access to so much of what they need?
Well, the latter scenario won't work. So going into this crisis, we had relatively, it'll just take a second, we had relatively weak business fixed investment, relatively weak manufacturing, we had trade tensions, but the bright spot in the US economy was the consumer. The household sector was a driver of the economy at 70% of GDP, okay? And Tom referred to this. We were expressing concerns then about lack of growth in the workforce and lack of skills and educational attainment in the workforce, and it was holding down GDP. We then have this crisis. The unemployment rate is going to hit 20% sometime either this month or early next month. So the consumer, which was the strength of the economy, the household sector, has suffered a real body blow. We're going to have an unemployment rate likely at the end of the year that's still going to be double digit. And we're going to have to spend most of 2021 trying to grind that down. So we can't afford to leave out big segments of the population. If we do, the driver, the engine of the economy, the household sector is going to be weakened, and we're going to grow more slowly. And the answer won't be, while there's tremendous government spending going on right now to try to supplement those groups of the population, we see how expensive it is. So we have got to get reopened. We're going to have to find ways for people to be able to change jobs, change industries, get retrained. And we've got to get dramatically better at that, because some industries aren't going to hire as many people as they did. And they're going to have to find new jobs, and we're going to need to see these shifts. So we don't have a choice but to try to enable that and facilitate it, or we're going to have a very, while we'll have catch-up growth in third and fourth quarter this year and into 2021, the sustainable level of growth in the long term is going to deteriorate unless we can make sure this is an inclusive economy.
And I would add to that, to even emphasize it more, being on the governor's strike force on the reopening of the economy, I've been trying to hammer the point that the demand side of the recovery, we're focused in government about, quote, how do we open up a business? But that doesn't necessarily drive consumer demand. And that comes from a feeling of confidence in the future, confidence in safety in the workplace. It's about confidence, and the market forces are going to determine the force of the economic recovery because of just what Rob mentioned about consumer confidence. And that's the part that I'm most worried about, is how do we build a confidence level across the population? Because the margins of business, there are 20% of the people are going to go buy anyway, and 20% are going to stay home anyway. The marginal difference is what drives the economy, not opening up at 25% capacity or even 50% capacity, but people not buying. So I think that's the big unknown out there. And I know Rob would probably very much agree with that.
Would. Yes, I would. And I'm very concerned about it.
Rob, do you think that, you folks have done great work on marginalized communities and the economic impact of keeping so many people out of the economy. Do you think that that capitalism still works? Do you think it's going to work for our country? Do you think it's going to give access to people who normally don't have access to economic recovery? Do you think, what do you think the model going forward is for us?
This is for Rob or for?
Rob, yes.
Yes, of course, capitalism is going to need to work. The issue is, which other speakers refer to, is we've got a situation, whatever the government says or whatever the government does, people are going to behave based on how confident they feel and how safe they feel. So we can open up every restaurant in the country, every movie theater. We can open up all sorts of hotels, which they're already opening. I've actually stayed in a couple, believe it or not. But people are going, capitalism means people are free to do what they want. They're free. And so without, what we're going to see is major shifts. Capitalism is going to work very, very well in that if consumers not comfortable going into a business and they're not at sufficient occupancy, capitalism, ultimately, they're not going to have access to capital, and other businesses are going to develop that are going to try to serve those customers. But the worry I have, I'm confident that businesses will adapt to this. I'm not so confident that the workforce will adapt to it, particularly those with lower levels of educational attainment who worked in a certain industry or worked in entertainment, leisure, in restaurants for decades, and all of a sudden they're going to find that there aren't as many jobs available, as my fear, and how are we going to retrain them and reskill them to get a new job so they can stay in the workforce and stay employed? And that to me is the big challenge. Capitalism will work, but the government and local educational institutions, local government officials, national officials are going to have to work on how to prepare workers to be more adaptable. We had this issue before this, but now you multiply this priority by 50 in light of what's going on right now. That's what I'm most worried about.
Yeah. Tom, you mentioned in one of your organizations for Texas 2036, one of your core values is this notion of resilience and having this value for resilience. I imagine that was on part of your core values before the crisis ever hit, and I think it's probably one that becomes critical for all of us, is what is our level of resilience going forward? What does that mean to you, the resilience factor, and how big of a factor is that in our future recovery, both personally and communally?
It is very big. Can you hear me okay? It's very big. Resilience, though, you know, it's not just about building dikes in the ocean. It's about building a healthcare system, for instance, that can react and thinks more about the future. The biggest issue I have across the whole healthcare sector is that we have what we call a health sick system. The incentives, the system is constructed over time to take care of people who are sick. That's necessary, but it's more expensive. If we could have a system that works on preventive care, early treatment, early diagnosis. For instance, we decided a long time ago that it was better to not wait until breast cancer was in stage 4 or 5, and we went to preventive measures. So I think that we have to build a health system that focuses on population health so it can be more resilient and not so siloed. We saw again in this pandemic how the silo responded, emergency rooms respond. My goodness, what they've done has just been remarkable. And we did not become New York City. We did not become Northern Italy. But the rest of the silos have suffered. The same thing is true in education. We're not adaptable enough. Rob has been a proponent for a long time. Let's just take one impact of the pandemic. Still one of the largest job occupations by absolute numbers is cashiers. Well, contact less payment is going to be it's here to stay. Well, what happens to cashier jobs? What happens to a lot of small businesses, retail, restaurants, leisure? You have to have people reskilled, and we have to have adaptable systems that can do that quickly. We need to take right now the unemployed workforce in Midland, Odessa, and retrain that workforce within a 3, 4, 5 month period to jobs that will pay a living wage. If not, the consequences on our state of forget the human cost and the social cost. The cost to the governmental systems is overwhelming. And we got to invest, you know, the state government. I used to say we need to move into the 20th century, but I swear we may need to move from the 18th to the 19th century when it comes to IT. Just think how businesses use data and digital platforms, and yet Congress passed a very substantial workers' compensation plan, and the state IT system crashed the first night. And they were calling in volunteers to take telephone applications. And still our government has not been able to disperse, our state government has not been able to disperse 100% of the federal funding provided by the workers' comp portion of the CARES Act. That's inexcusable. And resilience means that won't happen again.
Matrice, let's try to get you back in the conversation. Do you think that the corporate clients that you're working with are getting a major paradigm shift around this and stepping up to really help their employees and help with re-educating and retraining?
Absolutely. I think that, can you hear me? Is this fine?
Good.
Perfect. Apologies for all of this going forward. But everything that both Robin and Tom have said is spot on. Companies are having to adapt, and they understand that they have to be resilient in this time in order to be competitive and to actually try to capture revenue. And believe me, you know, safety and security is the first thing that everyone focused on with their employees, because and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but the culture of a company is the most important. And in order to have that, you have to have people, and those people have to feel good about where they work, what they do, and why they do what they do. So, companies are aware of that and are doing what they are trying to pivot. And the companies that do that will be the companies that will succeed. You have a whole group of private equity entities out there waiting for companies that they can ultimately acquire that will become distressed in this process if they are not able to manage the resilience and understand that they have to be adaptable. But to do that, they have to retrain their people. They have to have their learning and development budgets, and they have to think about, some of the things that they did those first 2 weeks, which was to furlough some of the non-essential employees, which typically are in the HR department and learning and development departments, as well as other businesses that provide those training and those other tools. So they will have to review their business and determine ways in which they can actually do that. We're seeing a number of our clients that are, reaching out to some of the universities and other places that they typically would not have gone to say, we need help, and what can we do, and can you help us? So, the ability to ask for help, I think is more prevalent than ever. No one's gone through this before, what we're dealing with at this level. And as a result, you are seeing those leaders that understand that they have to be resilient, understanding that they may not have the resources inside their organizations to accomplish the goals that they've set. So how do we go about doing that? And where do we go to find that? So they are reaching out and are asking more questions right now, which I think is the right thing to do for them to have any type of sustainable long-term opportunities going forward.
I would add there, one of the things we were working on earlier, which I think is even going to be more important, was saying in the workforce area, we have got to get to the point where regionally we're projecting workforce needs of the future, realizing that the educational pipeline, whether it's within a company or outside a company, there's a long lead time in educating people to reskill and upskill. And therefore, if you're only worried, too often our workforce commissions start from a premise of how do we find people to fill unfilled jobs. What we also need to worry about, what will be the unfilled jobs a year from now and 18 months from now. And because we have so many different economies in Texas, we have to have regional economic development plans that are realistic and are focused on what will be the workforce needs of the future. I'm not talking about 20 years out or, driverless car. I'm talking about what's going to happen next year. And then we have to incentivize our higher education systems and community colleges to really offer and incentivize students to take degree programs and certificate programs that will yield high-paying jobs. One of the things we did with data was to allow anybody to look across the state and see how many high school graduates in their community went to community college, which community college did they go to, which degree program did they enroll in, did they finish the program, and then what happened to their earnings and employment. And what you see, sadly, is that many students were enrolling in programs in which their earnings and employment actually decreased after they finished the certificate. And that's because community colleges are often incentivized as greatly to offer the access to any course and multiple courses as they are courses that will yield jobs that pay a livable wage.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to throw this question to Rob real quick and make it a little personal, if that's okay. But I had a young partner at Social Venture Partners, one of our younger partners, when he saw the flyer about the future responds, he called me and said, how can you have a panel about the future with all older people? And my response to him, of course, was a number of things, not that I can repeat here on this, but my basic thinking around it is that I never really thought about the future so intensely as I did when I had children, and particularly now that I have grandchildren. So I said, perhaps the reason that the older people are involved in this conversation is because we're the ones that turn out to vote, and voting matters, and who you vote for matters, and public policy matters. So do you have any comment on why older people are talking about the future?
So there's no age monopoly on thinking about the future. I know lots of young people. I was a professor at Harvard for 10 years, and it's hard to get. One of the challenges with students in their 20s and 30s is getting them to think 10 and 15 and 20 years into the future, as opposed to practically, tactically right now. There's no, I don't think there's a high correlation necessarily between those who think about the future and their age. The fact of the matter is experience that your other speakers have. If you've had a lot of experience and you've learned some hard lessons and you're willing to dedicate yourself to strategic planning for the future, you could be enormously potent. But experience helps. But no, I would say to your questioner, there's no correlation between thinking about the future. Your young person has more years to live in the future. I envy him. It's great, but that doesn't mean he thinks more about the future. And what we need, leadership is about thinking about the future. And there's not an age monopoly on it. You can be in your 80s and 90s and be very future oriented, and you could be 35 years old and not be thinking about the future at all. And so those things don't necessarily correlate.
And I would also add in that one that experience actually matters, and it has demonstrated itself during this COVID-19. Most companies will tell you that the most experienced board members were completely comforting to those who had never experienced any type of downturn in an economy or any other blip in the market, if you will. So to Rob's point, I do think that experience can sometimes supplant some of the other aspects of youth.
I'll add one nice note for your young friend, and that is that he does have longer time to recover from this than some of us do. In my age, I worry about how long I have to recover from this. But I would agree with what Rob and Matrice said. You know, I remember the oil embargo in 1973, the markets crashing in 1973. The savings and loan and bank crisis in Texas in particular in the 80s. And from those experiences, I do take optimism. I do take the opportunistic entrepreneurship of the American capitalism system as being what's going to take us through this. The hard thing for us all to think about is that this pandemic, as most economic shocks, creates a lot of what the economists call creative destruction. And that's very hard on society, and it's painful. And we really have to worry about that, because that has long-term consequences to our society. And we had just gone through, you know, if you stop and think about it, it took us almost from 2008 to 2020 to recover all the jobs that we added, that we lost in the 2007-8 time period to 2020. It was a long, hard slog through multiple administrations to get where we were in 2020. And this is not going to go away overnight. And it's going to take some focused effort in building confidence, and it's going to require leadership in the private sector as well as the public sector.
Tom, you mentioned that you have 7 grandsons. What advice are you giving them if they're smart enough to ask? What advice are you giving them about the future and how to navigate it?
Well,
I think you're...
there you go. I've told them keep their eyes and ears open and be very agile. And I've really stressed to them that an earthquake has occurred. The landscape has been altered. There will be winners and losers. One of the longer term issues that I think we will confront, I think larger corporations will get large because they will have the financial resources. I worry about small business and their ability to rejuvenate. Now again, out of the ashes will come a lot of changes, but if you look at the San Francisco earthquake, the Chicago fire, I mean, you name the major disasters in this country, usually we came out of it more resilient. Out of the Spanish flu and the Great War, we came out of the age of normalcy. As a matter of fact, we went through the Gilded Age before we went into another depression. So we'll come out of this, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick. And it's going to require leadership that is going to be critical. And with the loss of confidence and political polarization, normally we would be looking more to the public sector. But I really believe we're going to need a lot of leadership from the nonprofit sector, private industry. And I would just say one last word on the nonprofit sector. I learned through Harvey, a lot of philanthropies came to the conclusion they had to really think about strategically how to use their resources to take into account short-term need and medium-term and longer term. Again, going back to the roof analogy, many wanted to make sure they didn't use 100% of their resources right away. They wanted to be able to step in when government spending decreased or when X occurred or when Y occurred. The ones who were thoughtful about it really thought about strategically, how can I get the most bang for the limited resources I have? Just like we at Tex 2036, we like to say the big question in any enterprise is how do you strategically allocate a fixed amount of resources? Nobody has unlimited resources. I don't care if you're ExxonMobil, Texas Instruments. The big decision of any board and CEO is how do you allocate resources strategically to build for the future. And I think that's going to apply to philanthropies and nonprofits in this pandemic.
Tom, thank you for bringing that up. I want to throw this to Matrice. The last time we were together, Matrice, you were receiving the Silver Cup Award from TACA along with our former mayor, and I think that was like March 5th. That was the last time I was in public, I think. And yeah. You were the recipient of that wonderful award, and you have served on many nonprofit boards, particularly in the arts community. They're really suffering. What do you think about the future of the nonprofits and the arts, and what's your gut telling you we should be doing?
I think it's going to be the same as companies. I mean, certainly, this is unheard of. I mean, we've just not seen it. So, safety and security is still going to be top of mind, even in the not-for-profit spaces, and especially in those that are providing entertainment for in the arts for their consumers. We're going to have to re-look at how we open those facilities up and how we provide those services. The capacities that we've had in the past are certainly not going to be what they have been. So we're going to have to reimagine the way in which we engage with the community. The one thing that I do believe and still believe in my heart is that people need to touch one another at some level, whether it's physically or distantly. We need to find a way to have the human connection. So to the extent that we can do that, I think that we will, and those facilities will be looking at ways to reopen, but they're certainly hurting. It's not what it was. The stability that existed in those not-for-profits are not the case. You've seen close to $20 million being raised through the Communities Foundation, the United Way, and the Dallas Foundation recently. And then on Giving Tuesday, you saw a very large segment of our population really come out and be supportive of our organizations, and then when you look on the Health and Human Services side of the not-for-profits, Tony, I mean it's really painful. I mean we're touching not only the least of these now, we're touching so many people that you and I probably have had lunch with. So it's not just for a small segment of the population any longer. It's a larger swath of our communities that are taking advantage of these services and the opportunities. Unfortunately, these things also bring out the worst. The number of women that are abused at this time it's peaked. It's gone up. So the battered shelters and things of that nature need all of our help and ways in which we can engage. So across everything from health and human services, education, performing arts, and the likes, everyone's struggling. So we're all in this together. There's not a part of us that's not experiencing or feeling this. But to everyone's point, as we reimagine and retool, we've got to think about what it is and what it is that we're going to do in terms of how we engage. And I do think that that's a dialogue that will continue, and that we will all be participating in right now.
Rob, Matrice brings up some great examples of how the fundraising has gone since the crisis started, but it's no secret that the largest amounts of philanthropic dollars go to universities and museums and hospitals and buildings, and a very small percentage of it typically goes to frontline service providers and nonprofits. In your private life, you have an extensive background in the support of social enterprises. Do you have any encouragement or advice for philanthropists in terms of the most impact they can have with their dollars at this point in time, or do you think they should continue on with their strategies as they have in the past?
So as you know, I'm a little biased in this, in that I've been working for 10 years now on a venture philanthropy firm called Draper Richards Kaplan, which is all nonprofit, and we incubate new frontline nonprofits. We do about 20, 25 of them a year, and we do it through a venture form. We have a $70 million fund that we just raised, and that's our latest venture. And through that, we incubate new nonprofits, and they are critical and have never been more critical. So I'm a little biased. My advice is find a local nonprofit, emerging nonprofit that's either working in education or healthcare or helping in particular at-risk populations, and get involved and give them money and help them. It is not easy for these small nonprofits to raise money. They are essential to the community. Probably every 6 or 8 weeks, I do a reception at my apartment for one of them, whether it's Education Opens Doors or On the Road Lending or you name it. There's a whole slew of them, and they're critical, and they need help right now, and it's not easy for them to raise money. And they work on relatively small budgets, usually not maybe in the hundreds of thousands, maybe if they're lucky $1 million or $2 million would be larger. but they need money, and people need to back these institutions. Ideally, join the board. The young person who asked you about, gee, why aren't you thinking more about the old people thinking about the future? I give him back a challenge. Tell him to go back and make sure he's offering to serve on a nonprofit board on one of these emerging organizations. And if he does, I'll buy him a drink when they're allowed to have a drink with somebody. But these organizations need our help, and they need our help locally.
I appreciate that.
Could I add something on that point? I've now started 6 different nonprofits, and I think very, very strongly that just like in the private sector, what an important role entrepreneurship plays, it plays an even more important role in the social sector. It is how creative destruction takes place. It's how new ideas come to be met. And it is an essential part of the social enterprise to start nonprofits. What I take the most pleasure in, the 6 that I started, I'm no longer associated with 5 of them, and they're still running. And that's because I think I recognized early on I'm an entrepreneur, and I like to start things, build a institution that lasts. But the same entrepreneurship principles apply in the nonprofit world as they do in the for-profit world. And we need them more than ever, because we need them to have the attitude that the old doesn't necessarily work. Transformation works, new ideas work, new challenges arise, and that's where entrepreneurship blooms.
That's right. I'm going to ask each of you to respond to this question as we close out our time together. And before I ask this, I do want to thank you. We had almost 1,000 people registered for today's session. And so on behalf of our entire Dallas community and our audience, I want to thank each of you for your incredible servant leadership that you have provided. The last question I want to ask you is, Tom talked about this major disruption and kind of the entrepreneurial spirit that carries us forward. Matrice, tell us a little bit about how the last few months have changed you and changed your thinking and changed your priorities going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of what's going on now it's conversations that we were starting to have a couple of years ago. There was a study, I think about 2017, where employers were talking about the fact that we really didn't have the skills that we were going to need for tomorrow. So, as we've been in our world of executive search, thinking, what are those skills that we're going to need? What are the elements that AI and technology will replace, and how do you go about doing that? So, we've been spending a lot of time in those areas, and that's where we've been spending a lot of time. On a personal note, though, it's also in the most recent times thinking about, I have a 30-year-old, and what are they doing and how are they managing in this time? They're a little angry with us in terms of how companies are being managed and how things are right now, because they're in the height of their careers and their opportunities, and they're saying, this is my time, and I'm being grounded right now, and I'm not able to shine. So, it's just reflecting and making certain that, we leave this place better than the way in which we received it is probably where I'm spending most of my time.
Rob, how about you? What are you thinking? Are you thinking anything differently?
No, but let me make a comment for people. Just we're in the process of reopening. Most states, not all in the country, are reopening. Texas is reopening. Let me just comment on what success is likely to look like. It is likely, as we reopen, the decline in cases will slow. You might even have, at times, a slight rise in cases, okay? That doesn't mean that the reopening isn't working. We are at the point where we have to reopen. It's not a choice to let's stay closed longer or let's reopen. We have to reopen. What a problem is, or what failure is going to look like, is if you see a spike, dramatic spike in cases, that starts to look like it's going to really continue and overwhelm the healthcare system. But as people think through the next number of weeks and months, and you wonder what you should be looking for, you got to be in your company, in your efforts, you've got to be careful. You've got to observe social distancing. I'm praying that we do a better job with testing and contact tracing. It's critical, but we're going to have to wade through this. And if you see cases are stabilizing or even going up a little bit, we cannot afford as a nation to go back to a lockdown if we can at all avoid it. It would be a catastrophe, devastating. Many lives will be lost if that were to happen. And so the healthcare protocols and the economic success go together. And we're at the point where we've got to move forward. We've got to, but we've got to do it in a smart way. And everyone on this call is personally and in their organizations part of that.
Thank you, Rob. Tom, how about you for the future, the 200 years of Texas? What do you think?
I'm still, I'd rather face the challenges of the pandemic or any other challenge in this state than I would any other state. I mean, that's the bottom line, or any other country. Yes, we face enormous challenges, but I'm optimistic. I would just echo one thing Rob said, and this is really, really important. How we avoid that crash again is totally up to us in terms of physical distancing. And I call it physical, not social, but physical distancing, masking, all of those things play an essential role in preventing, and we cannot afford psychologically or economically to have to shut down our economy again. And it really does depend upon us exercising judgment about how we're going to reopen, because we are and we must reopen, but we have to do it smartly.
I appreciate this panel so much. Thank you to each of you for joining us. I think Albert Schweitzer offered us a remedy for both the economy and the psychology of how we move forward when he said, and I'm paraphrasing, we don't know what our destinies actually are, but we know what happiness is. And we know that the people who find it are those who have sought out and found a way to serve their fellow man and their brother and sister in community. And so for those in our listening audience, if you have found a way to serve, thank you so much for your service. To you on the panel, thank you so much for your consistent years of servant leadership. And for those of you who are interested in finding a way to serve, please reach out to us at Social Venture Partners. You will be receiving an email. We rely on your support to make these kinds of offerings happen, and we want to be able to help you find a way to serve this community and therefore making it a better place for each of us as we enter into the local economy's future and the future of Texas. So thank you once again. I appreciate the panel so much for giving us your time and your talents. Thank you all.